As anyone who is watching this video is likely aware, the GameGrumps have just finished their long-awaited playthrough of Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc. Overall, the series was one of my personal favorites of theirs, featuring some all-star GameGrumps moments, like Deep State Byakuya, Dan logically triumphing over Celeste after just meeting her, and their seemingly endless complaining. Overall, the Grumps gave the impression that they enjoyed the game, and that they're looking forward to playing the other two games, Goodbye Despair and Killing Harmony. However, I can't help but question whether or not they got the most out of this game that they could have. It's my personal opinion that first-time players of Danganronpa greatly benefit from an experienced player's perspective on the series. It may seem kinda hard to believe considering the repetition and constant stating of the obvious, but there's a lot of nuance to these games that can go unnoticed, as well as things that can be easily misunderstood or underestimated. The question must be asked: how much of the GameGrumps complaining, if any at all, is legitimate? So, one fateful day, about a week ago as of writing this script, as I woke in a tired haze from minimal sleep, I had an epiphany. I could be that experienced player for the Grumps. This plan was threefold in reasoning. Firstly, the selfish reason, it might be an opportunity to meet the Grumps or to at least be in their spotlight for a moment. Sorry, can't help it. Secondly, I believe that I have enough Danganronpa knowledge and capacity to research further that I could improve the Grumps' opinions on the game and help them to understand why it is the way it is. Thirdly, this would help make things more clear for Grumps fans who are not familiar with Danganronpa, and might alleviate some of the frustrations that fans of both Grumps and Danganronpa inevitably had while watching the series. Set on this idea, I emailed the GameGrumps to see if they would be interested in collaborating on this idea. And a week later, nothing. Now, in no way do I hold a grudge against the Grumps for not replying to my email. It likely came across as weird, and maybe even creepy. I don't know, I was sleep deprived when I wrote it. That being said, I still can't let go of the idea that I can contribute in a meaningful way to the Grumps community, to the Danganronpa community, and the brand new Grumps Danganronpa crossover fandom community. Will the Grumps themselves see this video? I doubt it. But I'm going to make it as though they will, which if nothing else will focus my ideas and help me stay motivated in the creation process. So, what are my qualifications for being the fan to make this video? Well, I have seen 3 playthroughs of Trigger Happy Havoc, one of them being the Grumps, and 2 playthroughs of both Goodbye Despair and Killing Harmony. Though I have never played the games myself, let's be honest, if you've watched them then you've seen all you need to see, I do own all 3 on Steam, because the developers deserve my money even if I myself have never played the games. I have also never seen either anime, I have not read any official manga, and I have no experience with Ultra Despair Girls or any of the spin-offs. So on those fronts, I am admittedly lacking. However, it is my understanding, based on the research that I have done, that the breadth of Danganronpa spin-offs do not contribute much to the main series, and it's understandable to skip them. With that said, I am confident in my Danganronpa knowledge, especially after the research I've done for this video. Any purist OG fans, I hope will forgive me for my shortcomings. Not that this matters near as much, but I also have a tremendous amount of experience watching GameGrumps. In fact, I've been watching them since their channel page looked like this. Yikes. Dan sure looks different. In all seriousness, yes, I am a very long-time Grumps fan, and while that in no way ups my cred for making a video like this, I just wanted to acknowledge the years of time I've put into this group of buffoons playing video games. Love you guys. So, just to clarify, this video is meant as a response to the GameGrumps playthrough of Trigger Happy Havoc, and therefore, I will not be shy with spoilers for that game. I am assuming viewers of this are familiar with the first game at minimum. That said, just in case you're worried, there will be no spoilers for Danganronpa 2 or V3, as the Grumps have not played either yet. This video is also going to be hella long and involve production unlike anything I've done before, so I appreciate anyone who watches through it, and I hope you enjoy it and learn something. This has been several weeks in the making. I tried to be as thorough as I could be, addressing as many things as possible in this video, but alas, I am only human. If you have anything else you want me to address, leave a comment, and I may do a follow-up video if things need to be clarified or expanded upon, or if I really just missed something. Now, I know this intro has already been ungodly long, but it is necessary for the integrity of the video, and I do have one more thing to do before starting the actual content. I just want to give a shout out to my research sources. Chief among them, and worthy of an extra special shout out, is the eminent John Wolfe. Although this video is made in response to the GameGrumps, I would be remiss not to mention John Wolfe's playthroughs of the Danganronpa games. These playthroughs, in fact, are the foundation of a lot of my opinions on the games, as well as perhaps being the deeper origin of my wanting to make this video. For anyone who wants to see a more serious, made-for-fans playthrough, please check out John's. The main reason I recommend his videos is that he does a very unique thing in the playthrough. He has actually played the games before. However, he has his then-girlfriend Kimmy, congratulations by the way, along with him, and she, like both Dan and Aaron in the Grumps playthrough, has never seen the games. This creates a beautiful dynamic through which viewers get both a newcomer's reactions as well as a seasoned veteran's interpretations. It's really a wonderful group of videos. Far from only trying to sell you on John's videos, I also want to acknowledge that this dynamic between John and Kimmy is what inspired me to contact the Grumps in the first place. Having someone like John to talk them through some of their misunderstandings and answer their questions would undoubtedly help them comprehend the game better and prepare them for their future with the series. Also, John's playthroughs were my introduction to Danganronpa in general, so I had that to thank him for as well. Suffice it to say, this video would not have been possible without you, John. You will forever be my fearless leader. Another major source of research, which I promise I have less to say about, is r/Danganronpa, which allowed me to refresh myself on the games without having to replay them or rewatch them, and also gave me the opportunity to dig through fan theories and perspectives, most of which were incredibly helpful, so thank you to them as well. I also went through all the Grumps' videos for Danganronpa as best I could, because of course they don't have a playlist for it, and read the comments to try and address some of the bigger issues that the fans had. I would recommend giving the comments a read because they're actually surprisingly informative and hilarious. Just be warned, spoilers are afoot. Now between the three aforementioned sources came most of my information, so biggest shoutouts to them. But I also looked at some other sources, which I will put on the screen now and in the description to make sure I give all credit where it's due. Lastly, if the Grumps are watching this, or, heaven help me, reacting to it, I just want to thank you for your playthrough and for enjoying Danganronpa. It's far from a perfect game series, but it is a damn good one, and you're in for some treats down the road should you continue with it. To spark some conversation, which was your favorite trial in Trigger Happy Havoc? Mine is without a doubt the second one, with Chihiro as the victim and Mondo as the culprit. I'll talk more about the trials later, as they're kind of the big draw for the series. So, with all of that finally taken care of, why don't we jump into the meat and potatoes of my GameGrumps Danganronpa retrospective. I will talk specifically about Trigger Happy Havoc, but first I have a few things I want to discuss about themes that pervade the series at large. It's not a spoiler to say that the ideas of hope and despair will return in the later games. The battle between these two opposing forces is, really, the crux of Danganronpa in both story and philosophy. Like many newcomers, I'm sure the Grumps found themselves a little confused about this dynamic, and understandably so. Why fixate so rigidly on these abstract concepts? They never use synonyms for either term, nor do they shy away from mentioning them in every other sentence, especially later in the game. Seriously, they never shut up about it. So what's the deal? The answer, I think, has a lot to do with cultural differences. Now, I don't pretend to be an expert in Japanese history and culture, but I do know that in a lot of Eastern religions, there are important cosmic dualities drawn. The most famous example is probably the Taoist yin and yang symbol, which depicts the universal interplay between two malleable opposing forces. One, which represents concepts like light, life, masculinity, hope, and the other, which represents darkness, death, femininity, and yes, despair. It may be important to note that neither side is seen as inherently good or bad, but both are necessary for a universe to function in harmony, and that the dots of one force in the middle of the other shows how they are affected by one another. In my reckoning, the Danganronpa hope and despair duality is another incarnation of this ideology. Notice the way in which Monokuma is designed? And notice that the symbol for hope, Makoto, is male, and the symbol for despair, Junko, is female? I'm fairly certain that these are no accidental connections. Now, don't get me wrong, we have our notions of duality over here in the West, but they tend to be more physical than abstract. Male and female, visual light and darkness, colonizer and colonized. Even when they are abstract, such as with good and evil, they're given physical manifestation, such as with God and Satan. Again, these are generalizations, and of course both abstract and physical dualities exist in any culture, but dominantly my reasoning stands. It would be a lot more common in Eastern media for there to be abstract forces at work than in a Western one. Having a villain like Junko, who is motivated exclusively by an abstract concept like despair, may seem a little strange to a Western audience. It would be like having a bad guy who's just bad for bad's sake, which does happen, but not very commonly. More often in Western media, a villain is motivated by greed. They want money, power over others, revenge, something physical. What does Junko want? Does she do what she does for money, power, revenge? I don't think so. She acts out of her pure despair. She certainly seems to have physical things, like money and power, but they're a means to an end for her. Ultimately, she acts in the name of this abstract concept of despair. She simply wants herself and the world to be enveloped in despair, whatever that means. It may seem like an odd, shallow motivation to some, but I think it has some very deep and disturbing implications, perhaps more so than if she had a more physical motivation. This is a big one, which again will continue throughout the series. The incessant repetition of things already said, and the characters presenting the obvious as though it's revelatory. While I do have some explanations for these occurrences, I don't want to make it seem like I'm in favor of them. I agree that it's annoying, can take some of the tension and immersion out of the experience, and is just bad writing. I hope it goes to show how great the overall story is that these pretty major writing taboos don't ruin the series. Now that I've said that, Allow me to play devil's advocate. My first argument is that the Danganronpa games are essentially an anime, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with the writing tropes of anime. Problems, just like what appear in Danganronpa, are also present in a lot of anime, even the best of the best. Characters telegraph their attacks with unnecessary shouting, while others on the sidelines narrate the fight like it's a novel. Characters overreact to the inane, and important plot points are repeated in every episode. Is it still bad writing in these cases? Yes. Is it unforgivable? No, absolutely not. We look past it in most cases, and I think we can do the same for Danganronpa. Now, is it worse in Danganronpa than most cases? Maybe. I really can't say for sure, but that might be a good discussion for the comments. I think it's bearable, if a bit exasperating. My second argument is that these characters are in a very delicate and terrifying situation. Though it may be excessive, I understand their desire to be thorough in their investigation, considering it means their lives if they're wrong. If your life was on the line, wouldn't you want to go over the details more than just once? Furthermore, consider the immense stress that these characters must be under. Stress makes a fool of us all, and though a character like Hina or Hiro are probably also just a little bit stupid, it's surely not unimaginable that the stress of their situation would cause even the most level-headed person to not realize something incredibly obvious to, say, someone who's watching them from the other side of the fourth wall. Now, do either of these arguments totally absolve the problems of the repetition and stating of the obvious? Again, I'm not entirely sure. I would say no, because as a player of a game that is almost entirely dialogue, you don't want to be annoyed by said dialogue. Having to read the same thing again and again can be tiresome, and seeing things that you noticed immediately presented as a major twist can make the game feel infantile, both of which are not desirable traits for a reading game. But I stand by my claim that neither is unforgivable, and the series is by and large better than the sum of its worst parts. There is far more good to these games than bad. A serious conundrum that was raised by both Aaron and Dan on multiple occasions was the question of how can these people possibly trust each other when the stakes are so high? How does everyone not pull a Byakuya and isolate themselves from each other for fear of being murdered? This point I think is far more understandable and perhaps even essential to the plot of the games when you think more about it. Having empathy for fictional characters is difficult at the best of times, but it's even harder when everyone you're meant to empathize with are super students with almost paranormal abilities, trapped in a murder school run by a cheeky robot bear. In other words, these aren't the most relatable characters. Makoto is meant to be the run-of-the-mill everyman that people can relate to, but I must admit, he's not a very good protagonist. Without going too overboard with reasons why, I think we can all agree that Makoto is just as hard to relate to as anyone else. All that being said, I think Danganronpa requires a level of empathy to be understood. Even though none of us are ultimate students, nor do we really want to be Makoto, I think we can still find the humanity in these characters and understand what a raw deal they've been served. Imagine yourself in Hope's Peak Academy during these events. How would you react? Would you stay away from everyone else, trying to eliminate any possibility of being killed via physical distance? Or would you try to befriend the others and find a sense of unity and emotional support during these trials, lessening the possibility of being killed with camaraderie? Depending on your answer, you may be more inclined to either hope or despair, which may itself be part of the grander argument of the game. The vast majority of the characters take the route of hope, and for better or worse, they stick by it. The moral quandary at play here is thus: is it better to survive alone or to die among friends? There are arguments for both sides, and the attraction of this question is precisely that there is no right answer. Danganronpa largely takes the side of the latter perspective, arguing that humanity's hope lies not in survival, but in love. To unnecessarily quote Cassandra Clare's Clockwork Princess, "There are so many worse things than death. Not to be loved, or not to be able to love, that is worse." Danganronpa would certainly agree. Might any of the students at any moment break and kill another? Absolutely. So, is it worth maintaining hope in the face of that risk? What counts as evidence in these trials? It seems to me that Danganronpa relies a lot on conjecture and hearsay in order for their trials to run. Is this a problem with the game? Aaron certainly seems to think so, especially earlier on in the playthrough. I want to acknowledge that yes, in a real courtroom trial, a lot of what the students present as evidence would not count for much. However, the important thing to remember here is that this is not a real courtroom. The circumstance that the students of Hope's Peak are in this game is rather exceptional, to say the least. Because of this, one must suspend a significant amount of disbelief if they are going to enjoy what's going on. If you can suspend your disbelief at the sassy robot bear, the improbability of a school that recruits ultimate students, the mere existence of ultimate students in the first place, and the 999 other absurdities that this game presents, then surely you can accept these trials are what they are, and that the evidence given works within the context of the game. Not to mention that none of the students, with the exception of Kyoko and maybe Byakuya, have any reason to be familiar with courtroom proceedings. They're all young, no older than 20 at the absolute max, except Hiro, who's like 50 or something, so you can anticipate some naivety. Honestly, I think they're doing the best they can with what they got. Not sure if anyone noticed, since it was so subtle, but most of the blood in this game is pink. Why is that? Well, I think the main reason is that it's more stylistically interesting and works with the game's oddball modus operandi. Nice $10 term, right? I must seem pretty smart. Anyway, the pink blood of Danganronpa is pretty iconic, and I think that makes the death scenes more memorable. I've heard arguments that the pink blood was put in the game to keep the age rating lower, but since the game is rated M for mature here and the equivalent of that in Japan, I'm not sure if that reasoning stands. Perhaps the developers were hoping that it would lower the rating, and even though it didn't, they still liked how it looked. I'm not sure. That seems to be the consensus based on what I've read online. I also want to mention the one part in Trigger Happy Havoc where we do see red blood, which is the classroom where the tragedy is said to have begun. This, in a really cool contrast to the rest of the game, emphasizes the brutality and horror of this location. It makes it especially spoopy in layman's terms. Danganronpa. Yep, it's that time. Time to give a quick shout out to the absolutely phenomenal voice acting this game has. And not just this game. I don't think it's even remotely a spoiler to say the rest of the series follows suit with outstanding voice acting on all fronts. It's especially awesome because with a visual novel such as this, one would expect mediocre voice acting at best. They really did some great work with these characters, bringing a special kind of life to them. Special shoutouts to the VAs for Junko, Toko, Celeste, Taka, and Monokuma for going all out. But everyone did a great job. Applause all around. I actually can't believe the Grumps didn't point this out. Like, seriously, I don't think they complimented the voice acting once the whole series. Correct me if I'm wrong, but shame on you guys. Many shames upon you. While Danganronpa tells a great story with great characters and great twists, it's pretty widely agreed that the gameplay parts of the game are at best unnecessary and at worst horrendous. Sorry to call you out, Mr. Aaron Hansen, but you clearly did not have a sufficient grasp of the controls to get through the trial smoothly. Not once did you counter the enemy's fever time during bullet time battle. It took you multiple trials to understand the speeding up and slowing down of time during the non-stop debates, and rather than take a look at the tutorials, which do explain everything you need to know, you chose to flop like a grounded flounder through them and accidentally bump into success. Gentle ribbing aside, this is one case which I am actually on your side, Aaron. The gameplay sucks. I mentioned at the top of the video that I've never myself played Danganronpa, but even I can tell that these shoehorned gameplay sections are pretty unnecessary to the game, and maybe even act as a detriment. In my personal opinion, they should have either spent more time on these mini-games and given them even a slight degree of fun, or else tossed them entirely and gone for a straight visual novel. Even still, I do like some of what the mini-games contribute to the feel of the game. Since the biggest story moments of the game involve solving mysteries, attending trials, and witnessing the twisty-turny nature of said trials, I like that they tried to involve the player in the process. These moments of input are what separate Danganronpa as a game from similar things in movies and books. Were they more adeptly developed, these minigames could go from one of the lowest downsides of the game to some of the highlights. Involving the player in solving the mystery really helps put you in the story, and gives you an opportunity to have the aha moments for yourself, and of course justifies the creation of a game rather than an anime. The problem is that the gameplay is simply no good, and most of the time comes across as a last-minute addition rather than something that the game is built around. Sorry, but as it is, it's just bad. I forgive you, Aaron, for sucking at it. Before moving on, I just want to say that the mini-games in the later games do change, and they do, in some ways, get better. They never really achieve the level of player integration that I would like to see, but it is what it is. Okay, now that I've addressed these concepts that pertain to the series at large, I want to move into Trigger Happy Havoc itself. Why don't we start at the beginning? Wow. For a series that's all about these trials, they sure do start with a banger. You'll take a sigh of relief, I'm sure, in knowing that this first trial is, almost factually, the worst one in the entire series. The answer is just so obvious that it's not even funny. But what if I told you that this trial doesn't suck so bad in all cases? What if, perchance, I were to tell you that the reason this trial sucks is actually your fault? Okay, that's probably a bit too far, but I do have evidence to show that the reason this trial sucks isn't just that it's badly conceived. If I could point a finger to the one aspect of this trial that ruins the whole thing, it's what Sayaka wrote on the wall behind her. 11037, aka Leon's name. With that one piece of evidence, almost everything else lines up and the answer becomes certain. So why did the developers do this? Well, the answer is that they did it because they're Japanese. Allow me to explain. After first seeing this trial, I had to ask myself, does this trial differ at all in the Japanese version? Did Sayaka write Leon's name in Japanese behind her in that version? And the answers to those questions are, it doesn't, and no, she did not. In the Japanese version, the wall still says 11037. So the question is then, since the Japanese is the original, how did the translation to English ruin the point? And in what ways does this make more sense in the Japanese version? It's at this point that I want to show a specific example from r/Danganronpa that I think really explains this well. I'll elaborate upon it afterwards, but first I shall read you this comment left by The Riven. As far as I know, this is how she originally wrote the name, which is exactly why it seems absurdly simple to anyone outside of Japan. As for why she used Roman letters, Sayaka has, according to Ultra Despair Girls, over 100 million fans, which is an absurdly high number for a nationwide celebrity, meaning she was almost certainly known worldwide, which means knowing English is a job requirement for her. And in case you didn't notice, Leon isn't exactly a common Japanese name, so she may not have known how to write it in kanji, and if she somehow did, there's a good chance others wouldn't. So Roman letters would have actually been more convenient, especially if she didn't know she'll live long enough to write the full name. Now this comment is what sold me on Leon's trial actually not being so bad when you really think about it. What the Riven is saying is that Sayaka is so world famous that she would very likely have to know English for her job. Because of this, it would have been easy for her to write Leon's name in English on the wall. However, this theory can actually go deeper if we consider this from Leon's perspective. Leon, like everyone else in the game, is Japanese. It's certainly possible, likely even, that the students would understand the Latin script used in English and would have a grasp on Romaji, which is the writing of Japanese words in the Latin script. Because of this, Sayaka would feel confident in at least someone recognizing Leon's name in English and figuring out the crime. So, what about Leon himself? Well, in the heat of the crime, it's more than likely that Leon would not see the 11037. If he did see it, the odds of him recognizing his upside-down name in English is much lower than if Sayaka had written it in Japanese, if she even knew how. All in all, Sayaka was taking a bet that Leon wouldn't look too closely, but everyone else would in their investigation. And that bet paid off. All things considered, one can now see how this trial would not be even half as bad in Japanese as English, and actually makes significantly more sense. Just like Leon himself, it would be much less likely that a Japanese player would recognize Leon's upside-down name in English than an English player. A Japanese player might figure it out and feel like a detective for doing so, whereas an English player that didn't figure it out would have to be pretty incompetent. The problem is with the translation. Even still, I actually found a really well-written YouTube comment that makes an argument for the English version of this trial. The comment is by Ruki and says, quoting from the Grumps, "We know it's Leon. We have the writing. Why would we need anything else?" Ruki then goes on, "Because you need to convince a group of teenagers that you're not trying to find a culprit in a series of numbers to avoid being guilty." And Ruki, you make a great point here. Remember that Makoto is actually the main suspect in this trial going into it, because of the location of the body and his personal closeness to the victim. Come to think of it, anyone could have written Leon's name on the wall to pin the crime on him. Maybe they would have even thought to dip Sayaka's finger in blood to make it look like she'd done it. It didn't turn out that way, but since you're playing as suspect numero uno, you need to be all the more clear about your point. Match that with the previous point that Makoto is Japanese, and therefore is more likely to not have noticed the numbers are Leon's name than if he was English, and suddenly Trial 1 doesn't look near as bad. Still kinda bad, still the worst in the whole series, but not as bad. I mentioned earlier in the video that this is my favorite trial in the game, and I think I have good reasoning for it. But before I delve into that, I think there are some important social issues to discuss surrounding this trial. The victim of this trial, Chihiro, presents some troublesome representations. As the Grumps make clear, the other students' responses to Chihiro's gender twist in this game can be read as transphobic. I'm fairly sure that this is unintentional on the part of the developers, and it's probably more the fault of poor planning and incompetence. Whether intentional or not, these readings are still present and should be acknowledged. Just because discrimination is accidental does not stop it from existing. However, I do want to explain what I believe are the intentions of the developers, so that you can understand why Chihiro is written this way. The first thing to note is that Trigger Happy Havoc is now almost 11 years old. To pretend that trans rights were not an issue back then is fraudulent, however they certainly were not as visible as they are now. And with that in mind, it may not even have occurred to the developers that Chihiro could be seen as offensive, and therefore this is just a poorly aged portrayal. Does this forgive it? No, but it does explain it. A lot has happened in these past 11 years in terms of social issues, and the world's perspective on trans people has certainly changed as well. I want to shift gears a bit here and explain a different reading of Chihiro that actually brings up some important progressive gender questions. Chihiro is biologically male. We can determine this by how Sakura discovers Chihiro's secret. It seems that in her physical search of the body, Sakura found that Chihiro has male genitalia. Whatever Chihiro identifies as, we can at least be sure of that. Now, the way that the game discusses Chihiro's gender is not so much that Chihiro is a biological male who identifies as female, but that they are a male who has been hurt so much by gender normative expectations that they feel they must disguise themselves in order to be accepted. Chihiro is small and physically weak, and these are traits that males in gender normative terms are not supposed to be. Chihiro has been bullied into submission for not being manly enough. Because of this, they start to wear girls' clothing and take on a female identity to avoid bullying and judgment. It is far more acceptable in a gender normative society to be a petite girl than a weak boy. Chihiro's problem, it seems, is not really a matter of gender identity, but rather of other people's prescribed gender expectations. In fact, Chihiro seems to suggest that once they get stronger in a physical sense, they would like to go back to being male. This is why they get help from Mondo, a person who exemplifies the traditional idea of masculinity by which Chihiro has suffered in lacking. Once Mondo is told Chihiro's secret, he becomes incredibly jealous of Chihiro's internal strength, so the story goes. He feels threatened by Chihiro, and in a moment of true weakness, falls to his dark side and kills Chihiro. When you consider all this, Chihiro is actually a very progressive character, just not in the way people expect. Chihiro's very existence in this game calls into question the validity of gender normative expectations, and argues that society's rules for what makes a man and what makes a woman are very much twisted. What really matters, the game argues, is not how big and burly a man is, but his strength of character. The game shows how Chihiro has suffered because of these gender normative rules, and therefore suggests that they are wrong. But not only Chihiro suffers. This whole chapter actually revolves a lot around these problems. Mondo himself is a victim of them as well. Being the ultimate biker gang leader, Mondo is held to the ideas of masculinity more than any other character. Any moment of femininity would bring into question his right to rule, and so he's trained himself to avoid anything that isn't the utmost of manliness. This is ultimately what breaks him and causes him to kill Chihiro. The threat of his secret being revealed is more than just revealing the fate of his brother. It shows Mondo's vanity and weakness, and would be harmful to his identity as a macho man. Then, to be approached by Chihiro, who is physically everything that Mondo fears about himself, and to be shown that Chihiro has such immense strength of character, Mondo is shell-shocked. If someone like Chihiro can be as strong as they are, then everything that Mondo has built his life upon could be wrong. his ideas of masculinity might not be as firm as he thought. We see Mondo go doubly deep into his masculine ideals when he takes on Taka's sauna challenge, and then becomes good friends with him. The challenge itself is an opportunity to show off his manliness, and his subsequent friendship with Taka is very much based on the bonds of masculinity. He doubles down because he now knows Chihiro's secret, and feels the need to show off more. If you think it's a big step to go from that to murder, well, just look at the real world. This isn't as much a fantasy as you might think. People with non-binary genders are killed all the time by people who feel threatened by them. People whose worldview is so fully based on their binary notions of gender that any deviation is an affront. It's the same as Mondo. And both Chihiro and Mondo are victims to these gender normative values. We see gender normativity in action in this game, when Mondo, quite boldly, asserts that women are naturally weak, right in front of Sakura and Hina, two seriously physically fit women. If things were different, Chihiro would never have been bullied, might have never felt the need to hide and change their identity, and would never have been killed by Mondo. Mondo would never have been mentally tortured by feelings of inadequacy, wouldn't have feared the revealing of his secret nearly as much, and would have never killed Chihiro. If only they had been raised in a world that accepted them for who they are. Okay, so that was very heavy and got pretty real, but I hope you appreciate Chihiro's portrayal a bit more. It's a shame that there are these transphobic readings of Chihiro, as it kind of muddles the otherwise amazing points that are being made here. Case in point, did the GameGrumps even have an inkling of this rich critique of gender normativity, or were they too sidetracked by the transphobia to even notice? I want to clarify that both readings are valid, and both can exist at the same time. This, much like gender, is not a binary system. You can be upset by the transphobic implications of Chihiro and still respect the critique of gender being made. The world is not black and white, nor even shades of grayscale, but a rich and vibrant rainbow in which multiple perspectives are possible and acceptable. To change the subject, I want to discuss the seemingly homosexual undertones between Mondo and Taka, which has been lovingly dubbed Ishimondo by the internet. Did they have any feelings for each other that went beyond their bond of manliness? To be honest, there are a lot of implied points that seem to point to Ishimondo being a reality. To bring in some deeper lore than Trigger Happy Havoc offers, in the manga version of the story we actually get to see what went on in the sauna after Makoto left. It turns out that after exchanging more verbal blows to one another, the bros get more sincere and start sharing their life stories and vulnerabilities. They discover that they aren't so different, that they're both trapped in society's demands for masculinity, which may explain the nature of their apparent friendship. If they have to play the role of macho men to everyone else, it must be easier to do that with a friend and confidant by your side, right? And then afterwards they can get together and vent their frustrations to one another. Furthermore, look at how hardly Taka takes Mondo's death. His despair for Mondo dying might be the most outward emotion shown by any character in the whole game. To be fair, Taka is pretty extreme in most cases, but this is a level of sadness that seems to go beyond losing a friend. Maybe Taka is losing the first person to ever really get him, the first person who has ever seen him bear all and bore their all in response. I mean that in a non-sexual way. Maybe. Now, does this mean that they were in love? Not necessarily. To be honest, into the whole Ishimondo thing as I am, I think it's far more likely that they're just really close buds who were never able to give off steam the way they could with each other. Pun intended. Seriously though, it's clear that they have never been as honest with anyone else as they have been with each other, including themselves. I don't think there's enough evidence to suggest that they were in love, unless you count the wall of double entendres they share. Decide for yourselves, but I think either option is viable and works with the story. Whatever the case, Taka's reaction to Mondo's death breaks my fucking heart. I think it's really clear that neither of them ever really had friends before. So to have them torn apart so soon is really tragic, especially after we see the catatonic state it leaves Taka in. Sad stuff. So, now that I've discussed the really important points, I want to bring up the other reason I really like this trial and chapter. Byakuya's tumultuous presence. I was quite shocked to see that neither Eren nor Dan seemed to like this twist, or even really get it. The question of why Byakuya would do what he did, mess around with the crime scene, lie during the trial to mess with everyone, it's because on some level he's a depraved masochist. He wanted to see everyone struggle with the case, and to make fun of them for not being able to solve it. When Eren calls Byakuya an idiot for doing this, as failing the trial means his life too, it seems to me that Eren didn't quite get the full scope of this moment. Of course Byakuya wouldn't let himself die. He's too much of a narcissist to allow that. In his mind, if no one figured out his involvement, he would have been able to reveal it at the last minute and laugh at everyone's dumbfounded faces. Byakuya was getting off in this trial, secretly loving every minute of people's confusion. The Grumps call Byakuya an idiot, an asshole, a scumbag, but I feel they didn't get a real sense of his wicked depravity. He's a sociopath, and that's what makes him an interesting character. As much as I love the Grumps riffing on Byakuya, I think they underestimated him. He isn't stupid, he just is so full of himself that sometimes he can't see past his own nose. The so-called deep state Byakuya scene actually makes his character all the more threatening, because it reveals the power that this emotionless, awful person has. Or had, I guess. And it makes his later change of heart all the more fascinating as well. Aside from Byakuya's motivations, I actually think his actions in this trial are just really great storytelling. As a player, even if you detest Byakuya, like most people do, you still overestimate him. And so even though the clues are there to figure out what he did, almost no one ever would. People just don't do what he does. And yet he did. I think Byakuya's involvement in Mondo's trial is one of the most interesting parts of the whole game, and I'm slightly sad the Grumps didn't see it that way. Just to address something that seems silly and shallow on the first examination, I want to talk about Makoto's secret being his bedwetting. Yes, it is definitely silly, but does it not fit his character so perfectly? He's so flawlessly average that this is the darkest dirt Monokuma could drag up on him. You know what we call that, Eren? A flavor win. Okay, so it's almost time to move on to the next chapter, but first I just want to talk about one more minor connection. Notice how Mondo's older brother's name is Daya? Daya, Mondo, Diamondo, Diamond. Not so subtle, writers, but still appreciated. Dan noticed during the series the connection between their biker gang being called Crazy Diamond and the classic Pink Floyd song, which I'm sure is intentional. So, my final words to those who fell this chapter: Mondo, Chihiro, Taka's sanity. Shine on, you crazy diamonds. So, what the hell, right? This is one hell of a trial. First things first, having two victims really ups the ante for the case, and I like that a lot. The chaos of this chapter is honestly very attractive to me. It's a whole lot of fun for sure. Overall, this isn't one of the better trials, but it's still got perks. I'll start my analysis by simply saying that I think the twist of Celeste's real surname being Yasuhiro is pretty goofy. The whole idea that Hifumi called out Yasuhiro as he died, and that they used his tendency to refer to people by their last name as evidence, it's just conjecture. And I know there's a lot of conjecture in this game, but this is like a whole nother level. You can't use Hifumi's tendencies while healthy and alive as evidence for how he would behave on his deathbed. It's just flimsy. And of course it works out because the game is designed to do that, but it kind of takes me out of it when it's this much of a stretch. You certainly have to take this game with a grain of salt, suspend your disbelief in order to enjoy it, but sometimes they just push it a bit too far for my liking. One of the big questions that the Grumps had during this chapter is about the circumstances surrounding Hifumi's death. Here's the sitch. Hifumi faked being dead. His body was discovered at the same time as Taka's actually dead body, and so half of the investigating students thought Hifumi was really dead when the body alarm went off. Hifumi then met up with Celeste again and was murdered by her, and then was found again by the investigators, and Monokuma's body alarm goes off again. However, after the body alarm goes off, this time actually for Hifumi, he raises his head up again and gives a final word before dying for good. Okay, so here's where the Grumps seem to be confused. If Hifumi was still not actually dead when the body alarm went off, then why did it go off? Did Hifumi come back from death to reveal the murderer? Or did Monokuma make a mistake with the alarm? Well, simply put, I think it's fair to assume Monokuma made a mistake. Think about it. Hifumi, for all intents and purposes, seemed to be dead. We don't know how, if at all, Monokuma investigates the bodies before announcing their discovery. My assumption is that the mastermind assumed Hifumi was dead, made the announcement when he was found, and then discovered along with everyone else that he had not quite yet died. It's a simple, not very exciting explanation, but I think it makes the most sense. Through the mastermind's school-wide cameras, they would have seen that Hifumi had faked his death the first time, and then seen him get smacked over the head by Celeste the next time. It would not be a leap to posit that they just saw that and figured Hifumi was dead. The mastermind within the walls of Hope's Peak is all-seeing, but certainly not omniscient. The best aspect of this chapter is Celeste's execution. Dan and Aaron seem to have forgotten the true nature of her death, and I'm not sure they fully understood the meaning in the first place. Celeste was almost giddy to be burned at the stake. If she has to die, she loves the idea of dying in style. She thinks of herself as royalty, as evidenced by her desire to live in a castle and have buff dudes dote over her all day. So to be burned at the stake is a truly exceptional way to die. But Monokuma cuts this short by having her smashed by a truck. Being killed in a vehicular accident is a truly pedestrian way to die. There's nothing special about it. You can't help but admire the vileness of Monokuma here. He will not allow even the slightest satisfaction for these students, not even in the final moments before their death. It's sick, and that's what makes it so great. I actually really like this chapter. The twist of Sakura having killed herself is kind of easy to predict if you notice the right things, but even still, you might think it wrong simply because of wondering if they would actually go down the suicide route. I also really like what they did with Hina and having her throw everyone else under the bus. It kind of reminds me of Byakuya in Chapter 2. Speaking of which, guess which grumpy duo didn't really buy into that one? So, yes, Hina did legitimately try to get everyone, including herself, killed. You may, like the Grumps, and Aaron in particular, think that's really stupid. But let's just take a few micro moments to analyze her reasoning. First of all, much like Taka and Mondo, it's very clear that Hina and Sakura share an intimate relationship. They're very good friends at minimum, and maybe even... No, you know what? I talked about one ship in this video, we don't need another. Besides, I buy the Ishimondo one more. Anyway, Hina loses a near and dear friend in a very tragic situation. Sure, having someone close to you murdered kinda sucks, but can you imagine believing that person had been cornered into suicide by the people you call friends? Can you imagine that happening to the closest person in your life? Might you, even for a flash, believe that those responsible deserve punishment? Was Hina thinking rationally when she decided to send everyone to the execution block? No, of course she wasn't. That's what makes it so interesting to me. She isn't, like Byakuya does in Chapter 2, using her knowledge to screw with things just for fun. She's distressed, heartbroken, working in pure emotion. And someone like that is perhaps the most dangerous kind of person. I can understand the frustration with learning of the twist that Hina is trying to kill everyone. You, the audience member witnessing things, are sitting comfortably at home, more than likely not having just lost someone you love, and passing your judgment with your unencumbered logic brain. You say, "What the hell, Hina? How does that make any sense?" And then, giving it more thought, you realize it doesn't make sense. And that's the whole point. Yes, this is a game about solving mysteries using, sometimes esoteric, logic, but you can't apply logic to everything. Sometimes people forego their brains for their hearts, and that's as real as it gets. You might call someone acting irrationally out of grief a fool, an idiot, stupid. And you'd be right. The heart is stupid. But that doesn't mean it isn't powerful. And if all that wasn't enough, then it turns out that a large portion of Hina's motivation was caused by Monokuma withholding Sakura's real suicide note. Wait, Monokuma withheld vital information from the trial. And not only that, but he falsified evidence that may have led to the students making the wrong call. Is that against the rules? Well, not if the rules are only the school regulations. After all, Byakuya tampered with the crime scene in Chapter 2 and got away with it, so why shouldn't Monokuma be allowed to do that? Well, I will discuss the mastermind's relationship to the rules later on, but it seems to me that Monokuma is, or at least ought to be, tied to a higher set of rules than the students. For example, the whole reason that Kyoko and Makoto were able to get Monokuma to redo the Chapter 5 trial is because he set it up, therefore blighting the outcome. So, is the only difference here that the outcome turned out to be right? What would have happened if Hina had succeeded in getting everyone to vote wrong? Would Monokuma have interfered yet again and given them what they need to crack the code? Or would he have let them die and hurt the validity of his show? After all, he's clearly concerned with keeping his show legit, considering what he does for Chapter 6. This one I'm really not sure about, and I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments. What I can say is that Monokuma revealing the letter afterwards instead of just leaving them ignorant was a total power move. He wanted to prove to Hina that she didn't know her good friend as well as she thought she did, which is a very special kind of despair. It's very similar to smashing Celeste with the truck before she can be burned. Monokuma is out to cause suffering in any way he can. Before we move on, can I just say how satisfying it is in this trial to see Byakuya get sideswiped by Makoto. That whole section where Byakuya realizes he was wrong and even says please to Makoto is so good. It's moments like that where I have no choice but to stand and applaud the writers of this game. It's just a really cool moment of character development. Trust me, I haven't forgotten the bullshit Byakuya pulled in Chapter 2, but his humility is refreshing. Another beautiful little detail in this chapter comes from my dear sweet boy Taka, may Krishna rest his soul. When he goes all mental and starts channeling that big Mondo energy, it kills me how he still can't bring himself to swear. He really does become the perfect middle ground between the two. He gets all confrontational and rude like Mondo, but says crap and fudge instead of Mondo's more colorful language. Excellent work, writers. I love it. The Grumps had a few other important questions for this chapter, and I found a good YouTube comment from Muffin Man V, or Muffin Man the Fifth, that addresses a lot of them. Quote, "To answer 3 questions of yours, Hiro was able to hit Sakura without her dodging it because he hit her from behind, and then Toko was able to hit her because Sakura was still injured from the first attack. Sakura couldn't reveal the identity of the mastermind because she only communicated through Monokuma and had no idea who the real mastermind was. And finally, Monokuma said that he physically could not punish Sakura because she was so strong she dodged or otherwise stopped any attempts to kill her for breaking the rules. Of course, he only said this after she died, but Sakura could have definitely broken a bunch of rules had she realized she could basically do whatever she wanted." Excellent comment, Muffin Man the Fifth. I could hardly word it better myself. Your first 2 points are made fairly clearly in the game, but that last point is interesting, because you're right. Monokuma was probably very afraid of Sakura, which might be why he made her the spy in the first place. If he had that power over her by holding her dojo hostage, he would have less to worry about. Can you imagine how relieving it must have been for Monokuma when Sakura killed herself? She was getting awfully close to realizing she could do whatever she wanted, and even did a bit of that before she died, by breaking down the headmaster's door. That section heading sounds like a wacky hero theory, right? If anyone in this game were to call themselves out as the culprit and actually mean it, it would be Hiro. Actually, he does that at one point during the previous chapter. Anyway, hero logic aside, let's delve into this very straightforward and not at all convoluted chapter. Remember that moment where you have a choice to make during this trial. You have to decide whether to trust Kyoko or to call her out in front of everyone. Now, to be fair, there are other times in the game where it offers you a choice, but it's only the illusion of choice. There was that moment where Makoto had to decide if he should share what he saw in the gym between Monokuma and Sakura with Kyoko, and this choice is actually pointless, as the Grumps discovered. If you select to confide your secret in Kyoko, Makoto simply says, "Nah, pick the other option, douchebag." However, even though the game has set you up to expect all choices to be like this, the choice in this trial to trust Kyoko or not actually has different outcomes. We all saw in the Grumps playthrough what happens when you trust Kyoko, but what happens if you out her to the group? Well, that is when you get the bad ending. Now, this doesn't actually function like an ending in that it ends the game, but you do get to see the events play out. Essentially, what happens is that everyone decides Kyoko is the perpetrator, votes her out, and Monokuma does to Kyoko exactly what he does to Makoto in the proper events. She is executed, but for whatever reason, Alter Ego doesn't show up to save her. Here's the reason I think this is. If you do trust Kyoko, the trial goes on for a bit longer, so it could be that Makoto was saved by Alter Ego at their first availability, and they were not ready to save Kyoko during her execution. Regardless, Kyoko is killed and the trial ends. The game then suggests that the remaining crew live the rest of their lives in happiness, no one else is killed, no more trials happen, and this image is shown. Interesting, huh? It seems that Toko is no longer around, but since no one else is missing, we can assume that Toko's death involved no one but herself and/or Mother Nature. And yeah, since Hina is the only female left, the other 3 guys have children with her, and happily ever after, I guess. It's a really weird ending. I have more to say about it, but we'll deal with that in a later section of the video. Also, can I just point out Byakuya's countenance in this photo? What the hell? With Toko no longer there to bother him, did he just turn all jolly? It's kinda surreal to see Byakuya looking all happy like that. It's weird, it's messed up, I don't like it. Bad ending indeed. The Grumps had a bit of a time understanding this chapter. There are probably a lot of things I could chalk up to Eren is forgetful and judgmental and harsh on the game. But there is one thing in particular I thought I should talk about. Eren makes some very choice remarks about how there was no ding dong bing bong for the finding of the body. Now, to be fair, they do not have the full context of the situation yet, so it would be fair to perhaps assume the developers had made a mistake and not included the ding dong bing bong. But of course, our dear friend Eren has to go and say quite exasperatedly that the game is breaking its own rules. Again, this is a fair assumption to make, but it's terribly frustrating for Eren to always consistently assume the worst of this game. He gives no thought to the potential that the lack of ding dong bing bong is actually clever foreshadowing. Eren complaining about the game and these videos go together like Hifumi in 2D. But come on, man, just trust the writers. I promise this game, and the series as a whole, is very cleverly written and contains very few plot holes that can't be logicked out in some way, as I hope I am proving somewhat with this video. And if the past couple of chapters weren't wild enough for you, here's chapter 6 to prove that the foundation of Danganronpa is truly chaos. The most obvious thing to discuss is Junko's real personality revealed, so let's start there, shall we? First of all, can I just say that I love what they did with Junko here? I love that she's so absorbed in despair, so bored with everything that she's even bored with herself and can't stay in one personality for more than a minute or two. She makes for a really unique and entertaining antagonist. One question that I had when thinking about this section is whether or not Junko is problematic in how she portrays dissociative identity disorder, which is a real thing that real people have, and it does not function in the way Junko does. First of all, having the psychopath apocalyptic killer also have DID really puts DID in a bad light. People who have this condition are not crazy. They're not any more dangerous than any other person might be. And Junko is not a good spokesperson for this condition. But then, I thought, does Junko really have DID? The game seems to suggest her condition is more akin to a surplus of internalized despair, which leads to her becoming bored easily. Her personalities don't seem to be uncontrolled, like how people with DID will switch between minds without much warning. It actually seems like Junko selects her personality as she goes, making it more akin to acting than to a mental condition. I still think it could be problematic, as players may assume that she has DID without any real knowledge of how the condition works, and make judgments from there. If you want to know more about DID, first of all, go to legitimate trustworthy sources and read about it, but if you want a more casual experience that still gives a lot of great information and shows DID at work, check out Anthony Padilla's video, I Spent a Day with Multiple Personalities, in parentheses, dissociative identity disorder. Yes, that is the former Smosh guy. It's actually a really good video where he talks to people with DID about their condition instead of just talking about it like I'm doing. I'll put the link in the description. By the way, after writing that previous section, I realized I discussed DID and Danganronpa and didn't even think of Toko/Genocide Jack, which, admittedly, is a far less forgivable or explainable case of the DID equals murderer trope. I can make some excuses for Junko's personalities, but Toko, I'm sorry, you're an offensive stereotype. Like Toko's character needed more reasons to be disliked, hey? I can't help but wonder if these problematic portrayals in the game are more a sign of the time the game was made, or just weird translation things. Either way, they ain't aged well. Anyway, this is off subject for the chapter, so I'm going to move on. I just wanted to address it since the topic came up. Now, the next thing I want to discuss is a little confusing, I admit. I still get mixed up about it, and I'm 3 times through Trigger Happy Havoc. The nature of the students' lost memories is this. The students arrived at Hope's Peak Academy and spent a year-ish together as friends and classmates under normal circumstances. The tragedy occurred a year after they started at Hope's Peak, forcing them to take drastic measures and stay inside the school for the foreseeable future. They may have even lived out their lives in isolation for the next year. However, at some point, Junko and Mukuro got to work, killing all of the staff and whatever other students may have been in the school at the time, and strategically wiped out the memories of the students so that they forgot all about the 2 preceding years. There was likely no great amount of time in which they were unconscious, which is the part that always gets me a little bit. Now, the brain is an amazing thing, as we know, and it likely filled in any gaps for them so that their circumstance made sense. For example, if their last memories were from 2 years ago and they saw themselves in the mirror, surely they would look different than they remembered. But I think it's more than fair to suggest that 2 years is not so great a gap that the brain couldn't fill in the gaps sufficiently. Furthermore, since we really have no evidence otherwise, perhaps Junko's memory wiping techniques are so precise that they can wipe out the memories of being in Hope's Peak and knowing the others, but they can also maintain the memories of what they ought to look like in order to avoid confusion. Remember that this is a world of badass ultimate students and sci-fi robot bears, so is it really that far-fetched? Anyway, that's my interpretation. Let me know what you think and if I have anything straight up dead-ass wrong here. So, here's the thing, my friends. I hate to keep calling out Eren, because I really do love him. He's one of my internet inspirations. But dude, I think you greatly misunderstood the whole Kyoko and her dad thing. Maybe not misunderstood per se, but certainly misunderestimated. Not to get too personal, but as someone who literally has not seen their dad for years, I get where she's coming from. It's a mixed bag of emotions. On the one hand, you really want to see them again and patch things up in whatever way you can, and on the other, you can't let go of the harm they've caused. For Kyoko, she isn't upset that her dad left the family business, or even necessarily that he abandoned her to follow his dreams. It's different. It's more personal than that. Because he left, there were consequences to Kyoko that her father probably couldn't have predicted. She was now seen as the poor little girl with abandonment issues, as someone who surely must be emotionally stunted because she lacked a father. And whether or not this is true of her is besides the point, because Kyoko is clearly a strong person with great emotional capacity. She probably doesn't care that her dad left, but that he left her with this reputation. Of course, those 2 statements aren't mutually exclusive. They inform each other quite a bit. That's why it's so complicated. Anyway, to see a headstrong character like Kyoko taken so aback by her father's fate, to see her actually struggle emotionally for the first time, I think that's a really powerful moment. Which, in character, Eren laughs at and calls cliché. Is it cliché? Yeah, a bit. But here I am, a real person who can relate to what she's going through. I mean, at least my dad is still alive, and I could talk to him if I chose to. But I can't imagine being confronted with his bones, knowing for the rest of my life that I never got to have closure with him. I might have to send some texts in the near future. Okay, so this is going to be a pretty quick one. From what I could find, there are a couple of mistranslations that are really worth mentioning here. There isn't much, but just a few things that make more sense when you have the full context. First of all, in the original Japanese version, Hifumi isn't actually the ultimate fanfic creator, but the ultimate otaku. This explains a bit more about his obsessions. He's more than just an author, but likely an artist, a purveyor of anime, manga, and video games, and 2D. This fits his character a lot more than just him being a fanfic writer, if you ask me. The other one I want to mention quickly is Taka, who is listed in the English version as the ultimate moral compass. In the original, he's more accurately called the ultimate student committee member, or even, and I love that this is a possibility, the ultimate hall monitor. Why, translators, could he have not been called the ultimate hall monitor in the English version? What a terrible missed opportunity. Now I know that I understand true despair. This is one section that I'm actually quite excited to discuss. One of the biggest questions from the Grumps and a lot of the Danganronpa community is, where the hell did Junko get the resources needed to do all of this? Well, as discussed in the section on hope and despair, Junko's motivation is ideological in nature. This game doesn't go too deep into it, but it's important for this section to figure out what exactly the biggest, most awful, most tragic event in human history actually was. We see in Junko's images of the outside world, in which various world monuments have been redone in Monokuma's image, a picture of a bunch of people wearing Monokuma masks going all Joaquin Phoenix on their city. Since we already know that the ultimate despair is at least two people, Junko and Mukuro, would it be a leap to suggest that it might actually be more? Perhaps Junko had such charisma about her that she was able to convince more and more people to her side, eventually leading to a worldwide cultural revolution. Evidence seems to suggest that this is the true nature of the tragedy, an ideological shift from hope to despair. That would also explain the world monuments having changed, as clearly this is quite a significant event. Is this totally illogical? Does it only make sense in a comic book way, as Aaron says? In some ways, yes, but maybe not as much as you'd think. To use the game's terminology, we live in a hope world, us, in real life. Our world is defined by technological progress, humanitarianism, social justice, among other things. Yes, there exists despair within that, but by and large, our human society is based on things we associate with hope. Is it not possible that enough people could have a change in heart, leading to a revolution such as what we have seen in Danganronpa? Seems unlikely, and I pray that it is, but how do we know for sure? Surely society at large in Danganronpa was not predicting this kind of ideological overhaul. Likely, most people were living blissfully ignorant of Junko's plans. It is well documented that people in mob settings do not always act according to their logic. This is called herd mentality, and we actually see a bit of how this works in the game. Remember how Hina acted during Sakura's trial? How she gave up on rationality and was led entirely by her emotions? These tendencies are exacerbated in a mob setting, and it's not uncommon for perfectly rational people to go apeshit if they're caught up in a riot. In the right circumstances, if there are enough people who are sick of the humdrum day-to-day, enough people who are depressed, scared, stressed, masochistic, and any number of other traits associated with despair, what would it take to make them snap? Perhaps a charismatic leader who represents their despair in extreme? Remember that in Danganronpa, hope and despair are more than just words. They're very real abstracts that people are held to. Everyone knows someone in real life who feels let down by society, who wishes for major changes to happen. It may seem like science fiction because of the game it's coming from, but this is not unreal. History is full of things like this. People who feel disadvantaged in some way, and whether they actually are or not, they push back, and they fight, and they kill to get their way. Is it ever justified? Is it ever right? Now, there's a moral conundrum for you. We can go about looking at examples all day, saying this one is justified for reason X and Y, and this one isn't for reason Q and P. But that's not really the point here. The fact is, revolutions happen. None has ever happened on the scale that Danganronpa suggests, but also, as we know, the world is getting smaller. As we become more interconnected, so too do our ideologies. And in a digital world where your voice can be heard in all corners of the earth, the tragedy is not as fictional as it seems. To deny so would be idealistic, maybe even foolish. Will it really happen? Not likely. But all it takes is the right circumstances, and who knows what might happen. So, with all of that in place, how does Junko have all these resources? Well, because in some ways she is the emperor of the world. If the tragedy has indeed happened, and this is the nature of it, then Junko has access to everything she needs to make this killing school life a reality. Technology, money, power. We don't know who she's influenced. World leaders? Militaries? Cutting-edge scientists? Jeff Bezos? Possibly. And with even one or two of those kinds of people, what couldn't she accomplish? Consider that Junko was a student of Hope's Peak, and among swaths of students known as Ultimates. Think of all the different Ultimate students she could have had on her side. Is this killing school life really that much of an impossibility now? Keep in mind too that Danganronpa is in a pretty sci-fi world. All the evidence you need for that is the existence of a robot like Monokuma. That only makes this all the more possible. The question of the rules is a big one for this game. It makes sense why the students have to follow the rules, because otherwise they get spears in many parts of their body. But why does the mastermind also have to follow them, and why would it matter if they broke the rules? Well, one reason is explained pretty thoroughly by the game. The killing game is televised, and in order to maintain maximum despair, the Hope's Peak students must be defeated fair and square. If not, then Junko's despair might seem cheap and incapable of beating Hope without cheating. Remember that, as we discussed previously, Junko's tragedy seems to be an ideological revolution, and therefore everything hinges very delicately on that ideology having integrity. Would you be willing to subscribe to a group that goes back on its own word and doesn't deliver what it promises? Of course not, unless you're that much of a despair simp. But most people aren't, so we can accept that Junko has to be very careful with what she televises as official despair entertainment. That's why she has to accept Kyoko's ultimatum in the last chapter, because it calls into question the integrity of her ideology. It's bigger than just messing up her fun TV plan. It could collapse her whole movement. That's why Junko even loses with the pride of her despair. She dies, fully accepting her fate and embracing despair until the very end. It would be admirable if it weren't so wacky. Maybe this part doesn't exactly fit in this section, but since we're talking about Junko sticking to her guns without falter, let's talk about Mukuro Ikusaba, the 16th student lying hidden somewhere in this school. Yeah, that's a pretty major meme in the Danganronpa community. It's perhaps the ultimate example of this game's repetitive nature. Anyway, I want to address the man behind the meme, the 16th student herself, Mukuro Ikusaba. And why does Junko kill her? The first reason is that Junko could give a rat's ass about her sister. She makes that clear enough in the final trial, when she goes on and on about how incompetent Mukuro is, and how she was messing up the plan simply by not being a good enough actor or pretty enough to play the role of Junko. By the way, notice how when Makoto first meets Mukuro in disguise of Junko, he actually comments on how she doesn't look as pretty as she did in the pictures, and suggests that her Dobon Honkaros aren't as big as he expected, which Mukuro chalks up to Photoshop. Neat foreshadowing, huh? Anyway, Junko clearly does not have much respect for Mukuro, and even admits that she feels killing Mukuro was a mercy. Mukuro clearly doesn't feel this way, as we can see by her reaction to being stabbed. The way she talks about being stabbed is different than one might expect from an ultimate despair. She acts surprised, like she was betrayed. Now, this is just a personal theory of mine, but based on Mukuro's final words and the reaction to her death, she might have actually been having a change of heart about Junko. Maybe that's why she attacked Monokuma in the first place, because she decided that her sister was going too far and started getting some sympathy. Maybe she was trying to call Junko's bluff, believing that her sister wouldn't kill her, and that when she wasn't killed she could show the other students what was going on. In terms of the story, it might make more sense. Maybe in getting to know the other students from a new perspective, with their memories wiped, seeing their hope in the midst of Junko's despair made her realize how wrong it all was. It's hard to say, as we really don't have any strong evidence for this, which is why, again, it's just a theory. Game D. Anyway, I think it's a possibility, and it's a very interesting one at that. It would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that no one is exempt to the rules, even the Game Master's sister, and it works as a great example to the other students what happens when someone steps out of line. Look guys, it's me. I'm the entire comment section. Did you know that the dude killed via rocket crash in the opening sequence is the headmaster, aka Kyoko's dad? Whoa! No, but in all seriousness, that is a pretty cool detail when you look back at it. So, turns out Yasuhiro is actually a pretty decent clairvoyant. Now, if y'all are anything like me, you absolutely love Hiro. I know he can be a bit annoying, and he serves no other purpose other than comic relief, but damn if he isn't an amazingly endearing character. He's my personal favorite in Trigger Happy Havoc, and one of my favorites in the whole series. I liked him before, but Dan's connection to Hiro and the Grumps playthrough just made me like him even more. One of the most common comments on the Grumps' videos was that Dan has Hiro's other 70% clairvoyance, and after seeing Dan's predictions for the games, I can't argue with that. And part of what makes Hiro such a great character is that he actually lives up to his ultimate title on a few occasions. In one of the early free time events, Hiro predicts that he and Makoto will share a baby mama. Makoto is, naturally, quite terrified at the prospect of being wiener cousins with Hiro. However, in an alternate future, Hiro actually turns out to be correct on that one. Remember the bad ending that I discussed in the section on Chapter 5? Well, this alternate reality shows Hiro's prediction to be correct. Just to reiterate the situation really quick. Kyoko is executed instead of Makoto, does not survive like he does, and everyone lives peacefully afterward. Toko dies of mysterious circumstances, but it seems impossible that someone would have killed her, or else there would have been another trial and at least one other person would be dead. Anyway, Hina is the only girl left, so Makoto, Hiro, and Byakuya all have children with her, and that's that. Hiro's prediction saying that Makoto and him will share a baby mama comes true. Anyway, In case that one example of Hiro's correct prediction wasn't enough, there's actually an even cooler one. After Celeste's trial, Hiro makes the claim that no one else will be murdered. Now, it doesn't take much to figure that the death is far from over in this game, so most people will just assume Hiro's being his usual doofy self and ignore his words. However, you would be wrong to do so, because Hiro's actually right. None of the remaining deaths in the game following Celeste's trial are murders. Sakura is suicide, Mukura was already dead long before her trial, and Junko meets a, shall we say, self-inflicted death. In other words, even though Hiro's prediction is only like halfway through the game, he's actually totally correct in his guess, and everyone just writes him off as a dumbass because there's so much game left. Respect, Hiro. Respect. I don't really have anything revolutionary to say about this, but since we're having Hiro Appreciation Hour right now, can I just draw your attention to the magnificence of Hiro's burger story? Not only is it such an amazing story, but the absolute legends of developers gave the scene its own unique illustrations and full voice acting. Mental. That's right, Dan. I'm sorry to admit it to you, but you missed the only fan service moment in the whole game. Now don't get too excited. Remember that they are still students. Dan, seriously, put that thing away. This is a serious Danganronpa video, so I demand you cease this shameful Schween show. Anyway, yeah, there's a bathhouse scene with all the female cast. You can access the scene by having a wash basin named A Man's Fantasy in your inventory during the scene where Hifumi tries to talk Makoto into peeping on the girls in the bathhouse. If, and only if, you have this item during the scene, Makoto will agree, and you'll see this, which you did see in the credits and commented on not seeing in the game, so that's why. If you're sad for having missed this one, worry not, my horny pals. There is more to come in the later games. Some more optional stuff like this, but also more unskippable stuff, shall we say. Is it gratuitous, shameless, and unnecessary? Oh yeah. Enjoy. Yep, I have just a couple of things to say about Toko. I've already briefly mentioned the problematic nature of her DID murderer shtick, but would you believe me if I said there were actually some cool, subtle aspects of her character that make her slightly redeemable? Don't worry, I wouldn't believe me either. Let's try it anyway, though. Firstly, and I am talking about name brand Toko here, not Genocide Jack, we all know her tendency to stutter, but there are actually some moments where she speaks very fluently and without issue. The commonality between these moments? It's always when she's talking about literature, her passion. It's just a cool little character thing. Speaking of cool little character things for Toko, remember how she explains early on that she's not bathed once since coming to the murder school? Well, and keep in mind that this is just a fan theory and I don't think it's confirmed in the canon, this may have deeper meaning. It's confirmed in some canon that Genocide Jack leaves scars on her body for every person she kills. The fan theory comes in that Toko is afraid to bathe because she's afraid to look at her body and find a new scar. Here's a comment by Dubious Delaquite that made me realize this. Good stuff, my dude. The last thing I want to mention is a theory I read online suggesting that Hope's Peak may have actually known about Toko's alternate personality, known that she's a murderer, and still brought her into their school. I won't read the post verbatim as it contains some minor spoilers for the future, but the idea is that Hope's Peak doesn't shy away from associating themselves with criminal students. For example, Mondo is the ultimate biker gang leader, and he's still in the school. There's evidence to suggest that this is true, as in one of the photos left behind by Monokuma. We can see Jack going all dangle tongue behind Byakuya. That long-ass tongue is connected exclusively with Jack, not Toko. If Jack made an appearance in school, there's no way that she was subtle enough to not get noticed, and there's no way the school didn't know. The other piece of evidence, and it's less certain, I would say, is that Jack is known as the ultimate serial killer, which is the kind of title Hope's Peak gives out. Now, it's entirely possible that Jack came up with this moniker herself to parody her other personality being the ultimate writing prodigy, but it is also possible that in their quest to collect ultimate students, Hope's Peak accepted Genocide Jack as the ultimate serial killer on purpose. Either way, I believe it's unconfirmed, but it's fun to think about. Well, it's all fine and good to assume that Junko got her resources from being the most powerful person on Earth, but that only matters if the tragedy is real, and that Junko wasn't bluffing the whole time. Can we really trust the word of a megalomaniac like her? Well, here's the thing. I love a good open-ended ending. I really do. I love being able to analyze the story and decide for myself what the outcome could be. Danganronpa makes an attempt at this, but unfortunately, I think they leave so much evidence behind that you almost have to come to one conclusion about the ending. At least, that's my opinion, but I think it makes the most sense. Sorry if I'm about to spoil the open-endedness of it all for you, but it doesn't look good for Makoto and the crew. We can actually pretty easily infer from the killing game even happening that the tragedy is real, and what Junko said about the outside world is actually the case. We know simply from the fact that the events of the game happened that Junko has access to great wealth and power, otherwise she wouldn't be able to trap 15 students inside Hope's Peak, have it guarded by automated machine guns, not to mention that she would not have the technology to make Monokuma. Junko herself is clearly very smart, if just a little on the wacky side, but I don't think there's any suggestion that she has the capabilities to do all of this by herself. In all likelihood, Junko has in fact incited a worldwide ideological revolution, and therefore has access to the resources and people to invent a killing game. I just can't see any other way around it. How else could she make it happen? The only other explanation I can imagine is that the events of Trigger Happy Havoc aren't real, as in they're the dreams or fantasy of an in-world character, but I don't think there's any evidence for that either. So in the end... Wow, we've actually reached the end of this dense-ass video. If you made it this far from the very beginning, I applaud you. This video has been a bit of a passion project for me, so thank you for sticking with it. I hope this has improved your perspective on Trigger Happy Havoc, and Danganronpa as a whole, and that you are now prepared for when the GameGrumps eventually take on Goodbye Despair. Keep in mind that although I know what happens in the upcoming games, I have been very careful to shut that out in this video in order to theorize as though I know only Trigger Happy Havoc. What I mean is that everything I've discussed in this video uses only evidence from the first game, and that the conclusions I come up with are things that observant players of that game by itself could also come up with. Whether my theories about certain things are reflected as true in the future, I make no claim to. They may be proven true, they may be proven false. Only time can tell. GameGrumps. Speaking of GameGrumps, I want to take a moment to talk directly to you, Dan and Aaron. I'm doubtful that you're actually watching, but if you are, I have 4 final pieces of spoiler-free advice for you about the next 2 games. The first piece of advice is that I'm actually entirely in support of you taking a good long break between games. Without saying too much, things are going to change, and it's good to have some time to digest what has already happened, so that you can move on to what comes next. Trust me, it's much easier to get into the other games when you've had time to think things through. The second piece of advice is actually a bit of an opinion-based thing, but I think it's still apt to mention. The games get progressively better. 2 is better than 1, and V3 is the best. That's my own humble opinion, though I think a lot of fans would agree. V3 is controversial, as I've come to find in my research. I won't say why, but I will say that in my 3rd GameGrumps Danganronpa retrospective, should that ever happen, I hope to prove the V3 haters wrong. Whatever the case, it's almost unanimous that the first game is the worst. Not that it's bad, but the other 2 are so good that by the time you're done with the series, you'll think, did I really like Trigger Happy Havoc that much? You have some truly outstanding things in your future. The third piece of advice is for you, Aaron, my love. Get that attitude in check. I wasn't going to call you out again at the end of the video. I've done that enough already. But having just gone through the comment sections of all your videos, I realize now how big a problem it really is. I know that you are Grump in this situation, and it's your personality to be harsh and judgmental to games and storytelling, but you really are doing yourself no favors being so pessimistic. I don't think there was a single video that didn't have at least one frustrated comment about your attitude, and some videos had almost exclusively comments about it. If you don't already, you should probably find this concerning. These are your fans, dude. People who want to enjoy these videos. Sure, some of them are trolls, but I think far more, myself included, are just genuinely interested in seeing you put some more effort into the thing we love. There are some things I'm on your side about. The poor gameplay, the repetitive nature of the dialogue, you know the drill, you just saw the video. But you also don't have to complain about it in every video. By bringing so much negativity into the actually great parts of the game, you're missing out on why this game is so beloved. We love you guys, GameGrumps, and we also love Danganronpa, so at the very minimum, we would appreciate just a twinge more respect for the game. I think this comment by Ryan Giger sums it up well. The final piece of advice is more of a warning, a little mantra to hold on to while you get through the other games. This comes straight from John Wolfe, by the way. They never do the same thing twice. I repeat, they never do the same thing twice. No, I will not elaborate, I will not rephrase, and I won't repeat it again, so listen closely. They never do the same thing twice. And with that, I welcome you to the actual end of the video. Thank you for watching. I have some more ideas for future videos in this pseudo-essay lecture style, so look forward to those if you're interested. Until then, may your futures be full of hope.